Thank you, Temple, for being with me today to video record the salient issues that we want to get your views on in terms of animal-assisted intervention and the field of human-animal interaction at large.
Well, I'm really sorry that I was not able to be here in person, but I'm really glad to be here by this video. I'm going to talk about a lot of the same things I would have talked about if I'd been there in person.
So in terms of your passion for animal welfare, I visited one of your cattle livestock facility yesterday, and I saw clearly the welfare issues that went into the design. The detail to design was so tailored to your concerns for animal welfare. Would you like to speak about that?
Well, when I first started out, I went and handled cattle in many different places in Arizona. That's where I started back in the early 70s. And I started finding, well, a bit of this design worked here, another bit worked over here, so I combined all the bits. Now, you have to understand that a lot of the cattle here in the US are not as tame as many of the cattle that are raised indoors in Europe. So that requires a bigger kind of facility than you might have in France. I want to emphasize, design is half the equation, but the other half is management. And when I first started my career back in the 70s, I thought I could fix everything with an engineering solution. I cannot fix bad management with that. What I have observed over the years is people want the thing more than they want the management. And management requires a lot of detailed attention to procedures of how you do things. And good equipment makes good animal welfare possible, but you must have the management to go along with it and have management people that care about doing things right.
So can you speak about why the welfare of animals was important to you as you designed this humane way of working with cattle?
Well, back in the 70s when I started, cattle handling was terrible. Electric prods on every animal, yelling and screaming. And so I went out to some of the ranches and some of the feed yards, and I found that there were some people actually that were doing it right. So I tried to introduce this idea to other people. And there were a few people that went along with it. Now today, animal handling's gotten a lot better. I've worked through my career on improving slaughter plants. Today, our large plants in the United States are way, way ahead of where they were 15 years ago. And one of the things that made them change was large meat buyers, such as McDonald's and Wendy's, started auditing the plants. And when a big customer says you got to do things right, and the penalty will be removal from the supplier list, that's a strong motivation to do things right. But you have to have a simple way of evaluating them. You can't write some vague guideline that says handle those cattle properly. What does proper handling of cattle? So I developed a very simple scoring system for slaughter plants that was like traffic rules, stunning score. When we first started in 1999, only 30% of the plants could shoot 95% of those cattle dead with a single shot. And that was due to broken equipment. They simply weren't maintaining equipment. And in order to pass the McDonald's audit, they had to achieve that number. No more than 1% of your animals falling down anywhere in the facility was another measure. Electric prod use, if you want an excellent score, get it down to 5%. We did vocalization score. You've got cattle mooing and bellowing in the stun box, you have problems. They had 5 numbers. They had to make certain numerical scores, and there's also 6 acts of abuse, which are automatic failures, things like beating animals, dragging them, bad things like that. Simple outcome-based measures like traffic rules. And it really did work, because you've got to have clear guidelines where they can be taught in a day-and-a-half workshop. That's a reality, and I have taught many of the day-and-a-half workshops. And they have to be clear. You cannot have vague things like handle them properly, because your idea of what's proper might be different than my idea of proper.
Right. So how does that, what you just explained, how would that look like in our field of animal-assisted intervention?
Well, first of all, there needs to be certain things that everybody could agree that are simply bad that you don't do. You've got to make sure dogs don't become emaciated. You don't take care of their health. They don't have fleas. They get veterinary care, vaccinations, things like that. But then you get things that might be a little bit harder to write guidelines for. Like you have a dog that you're using as a therapy dog, and the dog gets tired of interacting with the people. How do you know when the dog's starting to get stressed? You've got to have a clear guideline that's easy to teach. Well, if the tail's between the legs, then I know that something's wrong. That's easy to teach. If it's not willing to interact with people, well, what's willing to interact? So you might write something such as when the dog walks up to the person voluntarily, he's not being commanded or pushed physically.
Right, or nudged. Yes.
Nudged. You've got to have clear guidelines that are easy for people to understand. And you get what's called inter-observer reliability. This is really important, where 5 different people look at it and there's going to be high agreement.
So over lunch you also mentioned about quality, and one of the things you mentioned about quality in terms of every tiny detail, such as slippery floors when animals are walking or doing their work. And what does quality, how would quality look like for animal-assisted intervention, for folks working in this area?
Especially with large dogs, they've got to have a non-slip surface to walk on. Some of the large breeds have a very difficult time walking on slippery floors. So I recommend to people in their homes maybe to put a runner down on that hardwood smooth floor. Now there might be a place in a hospital where the dog's walking on a slippery floor. Maybe we have to put some non-slip booties on it or something. But it has to be able to walk in a non-slip manner. It's very stressful, especially for the large breeds, walking on a really slippery surface.
So how can we enable practitioners in our field to consider the welfare of animals as front and center, not only from an ethics point of view, but also from the animal's point of view?
One of the things that's going to really help you understand animals is get away from verbal language. A dog's world, or cattle's world, or pig's world, whatever, is not based in verbal language. It's based in pictures. It's based in smells. It's based in audio. A lot of animals use tone of voice. High-pitched screams are distress calls. Smell. Think about what the dog learns when he smells the local tree. Who's been there, friend or foe, anybody to breed. I think the closest that a person can get to on kind of smellalizing is imagine these wine stewards. There's a few of them. They can identify over 2,000 wines by smell. That starts to approach what the dog is capable of doing. Animals often get afraid of a bad place, something they were seeing, or a sound associated with something scary. For example, if they had a scary first experience at the vet, they might be afraid of white lab coats. Or a dog might get afraid of the place where he got hit by a car. Animals tend to associate bad experiences with something they were looking at or something they were hearing right at the moment that the bad thing happened. And then you can get a fear memory. Then if they see a guy with a beard, for example, might be associated with something bad. They see a person with a beard, the dog gets scared. But a common question that I get asked all the time is, do animals feel fear and do animals feel pain? Yes. The fear circuits in animals' brains have been completely mapped. Some of that research has been hidden for years over in the neuroscience literature. It's just now getting over into the veterinary literature and the animal science literature. Yes, they feel fear and they feel pain. And one of the best ways to show that they feel pain is a self-medication experiment. Rats and chickens will both self-medicate when they have a sore, inflamed joint, drink a bitter-tasting or eat bitter-tasting substance to relieve the pain. And when the joint heals, they stop taking in this substance. Another example that shows very clearly that animals have some similar emotional systems to humans, Prozac works on dogs. Human psychiatric drugs have the same effect on humans as they have on dogs. The only exception is dogs don't have schizophrenia. That's probably why we have language and they don't. But anxiety, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, that can be treated in dogs with the same drugs that are used on people. There's some things that are different between an animal and a person. And I get asked this question all the time. We have this gigantic computer sitting up here that the dog doesn't have. You know, we flew to the moon, dogs did not. Now they're finding it tool using, animals do that, cultural transmission of tool using. Animals can communicate with each other, but there's one thing they don't have. They don't write it down. They don't have libraries. And I was reading a review in one of the science magazines on Frans de Waal's excellent book, And it basically said that one of the differences between us and the animals is you're reading this review. They are not.
When working with children with autism, they're also very, they have high sensory stimulation. So what would work for a child with autism, and what cues do we need to look out?
What I have found with children with autism, first of all, autism is very variable. You are going from somebody who cannot dress themselves to a brilliant mathematician, artist, and in France you really like the arts a lot. There's a lot of people in the arts that are probably mildly on the autism spectrum. So you have this huge spectrum going from the best person in the arts and music or art to somebody who can't dress themselves. Now, I've observed kind of 3 different ways that some of these kids will interact with a dog. One kid, and he might be a nonverbal kid, best buddies with the dog, loves the dog. He and the dog get along and understand each other. Then the second category is a child a little afraid of the dog in the beginning, but then really gets to like it. He might be afraid of it in the beginning simply because it's new. And then there's some where the dog or the horse is simply not appropriate. And it's usually sensory. The child is afraid of the dog because it might bark and hurt their ears. The horse might whinny and hurt their ears. They have problems with the smell from the animal, or they don't like its drool. It's usually sensory. And with that individual, then you would not use the dog or the horse. One size does not fit all.
So it's the practitioner who has to have the skills to be able to cue into the signals that the child with autism is providing you with in order to be able to realize that this is not a good match.
Yeah, and I've heard wonderful reports on horseback riding therapy and some nonverbal children doing their first words. The combination of rhythm and balancing tends to have a really good effect on the brain. It does not work for everybody. Therapy animals are not a cure for autism, but they are an important part of a good program if they're available. One of the places where scientific research is really needed is to figure out which individuals does animal therapies really work. And some people, the animal therapies really do a lot of good, others they may not work. We need to figure out which groups of people these therapies are most effective. We need to find out, well, what kind of kid is it that's saying the first word on a horse? I have probably heard that from 5 or 6 different moms. There are some kids that get on a horse and the first words come out.
Coming back to animal-assisted intervention in terms of situations, there are many situations in which animals are used, quote unquote, in animal-assisted interventions. Nowadays, you have animal-assisted intervention in schools, hospitals, nursing homes. With such a range of settings that animals are expected to work in, what steps do you think that we practitioners and researchers must consider in order to make it a very optimal experience for the animals?
Well, first of all, whether it be a nursing home or some other place, does the person like interacting with the dog? Usually that's real obvious. And you can tell that for certain individuals, that's the highlight of their day is when the dog comes. Maybe some other kid's kind of afraid of a dog. So you don't want some dog just running up to the kid that's going to scare the kid. You want to let the kid gradually come to the dog. So a real rambunctious, energetic dog might be the wrong dog to use with that child. It'd be better to use a calmer dog that he can just gradually come up to it.
For an animal to work in diverse settings over a period of time, sometimes we have animals going between settings as many as 2 to 3 settings in one day. Are those conditions best for the welfare of the animal?
I think it depends upon the dog. I think there's some high energy dogs that can handle that just fine. Then maybe another dog that's not going to handle that so well. You know, I'm a visual thinker. I think totally in pictures. And so I'm visualizing 2 Labrador retrievers that were in my neighborhood when I was a child. And there was one frisky, skinny lab. All she wanted to do all day was chase the ball. All day long, chase the ball. And there was another heavy-set, calm lab that would have made a good dog for somebody in a wheelchair. He could care less about the ball. You know, there are differences in the energy level. And I think some dogs might be able to handle 2 or 3 visits a day fine. And for another dog, it'd be stressful. This is where we need to figure out a really clear guideline to show that when the dog is getting tired. You know, when the animal stops wanting to interact, then it probably needs a break.
And I like what you said to me very clearly over lunch when you asked me, okay, what would be a sign of an animal that is stressed? And I said panting. You asked me, what does panting mean? Specifically, tell me what does panting mean? And so could you speak about how specific we have to be when we try to figure out the welfare or the stress level of animals when working with them?
Oh, I've done a lot of work with many different pork producers, chicken producers, dairy, beef, on writing guidelines on animal handling. And you have to have a clear guideline where you get that inter-observer reliability. You cannot write vague guidelines, no gray areas. You have to have what's black and white, something acceptable and something that's not acceptable. And you might even want to have some video training. I'm just visualizing now somebody pushing a dog towards a person, pulling it up there with a leash, commanding it several times to go up to the person. That dog's obviously tired. Where another video could show you just let the dog go and it just goes up to the person that obviously wants to interact. So videos would be a good way to train people. Okay, here are some examples of a tired dog. This is what it looks like. Here are examples of a dog that's very willingly going up and interacting with people. Has to be clear.
In terms of facilities that do not have best practices, you also pointed out to me the need to give people time to change. Could you speak to that, please?
Well, I've worked on improving animal handling, but also maybe improving animal husbandry on farm. If a farm had many lame animals that have difficulty walking, that cannot be fixed overnight. Where handling practice can be changed very, very quickly, or something like putting in a non-slip floor, that could be done in one weekend. Where if you have lame animals, that might take you 3 or 4 years to fix, and you'd have to be given time to fix that.
Coming back to the issue of animals working, in different capacities, there are some animals, particularly dogs. So, for example, I'll give you a scenario. I may have a dog. You're a handler, you're a therapist. You take the dog from me at the beginning of the day. You take him to work in different settings, and at the end of the day, you come back and return him to me. The animal does not know the person outside of the work time. So in these cases where the animal is used in therapy by somebody else who's not necessarily a family member or the owner of the dog, does that impact the quality of intervention?
It has a lot to do with how that animal is trained and brought up. It needs to be trained. Many different people can handle you, and it's okay. Now, if you had an older dog that had been just a one-person dog all its life, that'd probably be a bad thing to do. But if you have a puppy and you raise it where it's okay for many different people to handle you, then it's probably going to be just fine. It's going to depend upon the animal's previous experience. That would be a stressful situation for one dog and just fine and good for another dog. Previous experience has a very, very large effect on this.
And there are also scenarios where an animal does not necessarily live with the family. They live in a facility, like a boarding facility. And at the start of the day, they could be taken out to do different kinds of interventions. And then at the end of the day, they're returned back to the facility. Basically, they don't have a home to go. Their home is a boarding facility in which they reside in probably kennels. What about in such scenarios where animals, as dogs as we know, are social animals?
One of my students, Krista Coppola, did a very nice study. And she looked at dogs coming into the animal shelter. Okay, what do dogs need in an animal shelter? And what her study basically showed is they need to have a volunteer to come in and play with them and interact with them every single day. And when Krista played with the dogs, their cortisol level went down, their salivary cortisol. But then since it wasn't continued, it went right back up. Now, if that dog was taken out every day to work, it's going to be fine, probably at the boarding kennel. But let's say it then spends 2 weeks during a vacation time with no work, that dog's going to be miserable. So again, it depends upon the previous experience. Dogs need people.
Can you speak about the aspects that's related to the humans and animals that can make this relationship really sound and optimal for a working environment?
One of the things would simply be energy level. Like for a young kid throwing the ball for the Labrador Retriever that wants to run, that'd be a great fit. For an older person, a more sedentary, calm type of Labrador might be a better choice.
In the context of working with children with autism in animal-assisted interventions, what should professionals be aware when working with individuals with autism and animal-assisted interventions?
One of the most important things you got to be aware of is sensory oversensitivity. And it can be very variable from child to child. Like one kid might just see the fire alarm and he just sees it and he's afraid it's going to go off and he runs away screaming. Or he sees a microphone and he's afraid it might go ee! So he sees a microphone and he runs away screaming. So one kid's got hearing sensitivity. He might be afraid the dog might bark and hurt his ears. Another child will have visual sensitivity, so a real active dog that's moving around is going to bother that kid, where kind of a lazy, more quieter dog would be just fine. But sensory issues. And in my book, The Autistic Brain, got an extensive chapter on sensory issues. Some kids have sound sensitivity, others have touch sensitivity. Remember, firm pressure is calming. That can help desensitize touch sensitivity. Others have visual sensitivity. They can't stand bright, highly contrasting environments like a checkerboard floor. But sensory issues. And there's scientific research that shows that in some cases, the loud noise may set off the fear circuits in the child's brain. There are actual brain scan studies on this. And so that's one of the most important things to understand, that a child might be having a bad reaction due to sensory overload from the dog or the fear that the dog might bark and hurt his ears.
How could a practitioner look into this before actually planning her design or planning her intervention?
I would simply ask, is the child afraid of loud noises? Is the child bothered by contrasting visual stimuli? Does the child have a smell sensitivity where he doesn't like certain smells? The dog might be fine if it's been just freshly washed. Otherwise, he might not be able to tolerate the smell of the dog. Just ask some questions about the sensory problems with the kid. And for some children, the dog's not appropriate. There are 3 categories of how autistic kids interact with dogs. Love them, love them, love them, really understand each other, get along. The second category is the child's kind of afraid of the dog at first because it's novel and new, then gets to really love it. Then the third type, there's problems with sensory, with sound sensitivity, afraid it might bark, smell sensitivity. There are some kids that might hit the dog because they want it to go away because they're afraid it might bark. And for that child, the dog is not appropriate. And you can pretty much sort them into those 3 categories.
Okay, so let's take a child with autism. And the teacher is working with a furry rabbit, in the classroom in order to, do some social interactions. So the teacher has to be mindful of the behavior, the emotions, and the thinking of a child with autism, as well as of the animal. How can she marry the 2 together to make sure that there are no accidents and that's an optimal intervention with sound quality in place?
Well, does the child want to see the rabbit? And the rabbit want to approach the child? Because I want to make sure we're not stressing the animal out. There might be some children who might be afraid of it originally. Maybe they've never seen a rabbit before if they lived in the city. And some of the fancy rabbits that are used don't look like the bunnies that are outside. Might be afraid of it. Sometimes a kid's afraid of something new because it's something new. So you've just got to give them a chance to approach it. I think on a lot of things it would be very valuable for training on some very specific videos showing a very good kind of interaction with the rabbit, and then another video showing where it's going badly. People need specificity in this stuff. Remember, when you think in words, overgeneralize way too much. And I have seen this on dog behavior seminars, horse behavior seminars, cattle behavior stuff, even stuff on troubleshooting machinery. People overgeneralize. And I can't answer that overgeneralized question. Let's start thinking of specific examples of different types of therapies, and you can put them in categories. Okay, nursing homes, that's going to be older clients. That's going to need maybe a really quiet, kind of sedate, but very friendly animal compared to, 5th graders, 10-year-old kids.
So I'm hearing you say that it must be crystal clear as much as possible visually as well. And what about the idea of using cases that has actually happened in the field to sort of showcase it?
I think cases would be a really good thing. Here are cases where it was very successful. Here are cases where things went badly. I find in many situations, and I get asked things like, oh, what makes a school really good? Again, that's too vague. I think a better thing to do is let's look at cases where it really worked. It was this kind of veteran, this kind of dog, this really worked. Here's another veteran over here, and it went badly. And why? I think sometimes you can really learn from looking at the very best examples and looking at some of the worst examples to give you guidance on how to make things work. And that's going to be true whether it's using therapy animals or whether I want to change a school or change, a lot of different things.
To wrap it all up and in summary, what would be the 5 most important thing a researcher or a practitioner must take into account when working with, if you could speak towards dogs, horses, and farm animals? There's a lot of farm animals involved as well.
With all animals, you have to make sure they're kept healthy, vaccinated, treated when they're sick, treated if they get injured, veterinary care. That has to be given for all the animals. Now, one of the things that's extremely important with dogs, this would be the second thing, is willingness to interact with the people. And this is where clear videos need to be made. You let it off a leash, it runs up to the child, be an example of wanting to interact. You just bring it up, it just walks up to the people. It wants to interact. And then you need clear videos of not wanting to interact. This is when the animal needs some time off. You pulled it up to the people. You pushed it up to the people. You commanded it multiple times to go to the people. That's an animal that needs time off. So willingness to interact with the people. Now, some animals, some dogs do it all day. Other dogs need more time off. But willingness to interact, and that's easy to, to observe. I would prefer that a service dog live in a home with a person. There's some, well, any service dog. The service and therapy dogs live in a home with a person rather than being boarded in a kennel. But if they are boarded in a kennel and they're going out and seeing people every day, they're probably going to be okay. But if there's going to be a 2-week vacation, that dog needs to have somebody come in and play with it every day for 45 minutes and give it a good time, or it's going to get separation distress in the kennel. Also, there's some things you never do with any dog. You know, hit them, shout at them, yell at them, choke them, or drag them. That's no, 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 no. That'd be number 4. Number 5 for dogs. There are certain dogs that are absolutely not appropriate. Aggressive behavior, you do not use that dog. Aggressive behavior would be biting, it would be growling, hackles up, showing its teeth. If a dog does that, you do not use that dog. It shows any sign of those aggressive behaviors. Again, that is something that good videos would be very good for training.
You called it FTTD, is that right?
Oh, I went to a dog training seminar one time and they called it full tooth display.
Full tooth display. FTD.
FTD, and that is not an appropriate therapy animal.
Warning signs.
That's no, you don't use dogs that are doing full tooth display, growling, biting. Now, you might have a happy dog that jumps on people. That can be happy behavior. Some situations, that's okay. That's not aggressive behavior. But growling and biting and hackles coming up on the back and showing her teeth off, that's aggressive behavior. In horses, you must use the right horses. If they buck, kick, bite, you do not use those horses. If you're in a riding program where they go around in a ring, you need to vary the direction because going around the same direction sometimes can make a horse lame, so you've got to monitor them for lameness. Now, how about other animals? We need to use animals that are willing to interact with people. Okay, if you have goats, sheep, or cattle and they're butting people, you don't use that animal. Or animals are kicking or biting, or a cat that's scratching, you don't use that animal. You have got to pick the right animals that are not doing any kind of aggressive or damaging behaviors.
Is there something like picking the right kind of humans to work with?
I have found people working with animals. Oh, you might have a person that's dyslexic. He wasn't the best student in school. Kind of a socially awkward kind of person. They're often wonderful with animals, and they really, really understand them. What I have observed with stockmanship with farm animals, about 20% of people just have the knack. They just know how to work with animals. And research with farm animals has shown that people that really like animals and have a positive attitude have more productive animals and much happier animals that are not stressed. That's actually based in science. So there's some people where they're great with animals. There's other people where maybe animals just aren't their thing. So for good therapy and service animals, we need to have the right animals, and we need to have the right people handling them.
Fantastic. Okay, Temple. In summary, I think we've covered a lot, but I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart on behalf of the board of IAIO and all our global members for taking the time and to have a wonderful conversation. At some point, we hope you will attend one of our conferences, and it'll be a delight for everybody to meet you.
I'm really sorry I wasn't able to be at the conference, but thank you so much for having me on this video.